I just fell in love at first sight, basically, when I saw her singing Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend. And I don't know why. I guess it's everything a little girl would love. There's dancing and dresses, and it's pink and sparkly. I don't know, but that's how it started. And I love that movie, and I love Some Like It Hot. My best guess is she was different than your typical actress. She wasn't satisfied being just a pretty face or a blonde bombshell. She really wanted to be a great actress. She wanted to learn about art and literature. She wanted to better herself. And I think we can all kind of relate to that. And she was an underdog growing up, which I think a lot of us can also relate to. She had to work very hard for what she achieved. And I think the fact that she did feel like an outsider and she worked so hard is something at some point all of us can kind of relate to. And I remember thinking as a kid, if she could go from being an orphan to one of the most famous women in the world, then there's nothing I can't do. And so she was very inspiring to me in that way. And I think people pick up on these things whether you realize it or not. Personality, I think, like everyone, she had good days and bad days, but for the most part, I think she took herself fairly seriously. But she had a very good sense of humor and very quick-witted, and that made her fun to talk to, no matter who you were. If you were a fan who stopped her for an autograph, or a great poet or writer, she was fun to talk to and a fun person. We also know that she had a darker side that would emerge probably just with the people who were closest to her. But I think if you were to meet her at a dinner party or a club, you'd probably enjoy her company very much. She did have a problem with depression and anxiety. And I think that if she were alive today, she would be much happier because the therapy is better and we have antidepressants now. I think there was that underlying depression that she had throughout her life. She was afraid of mental illness, which ran in her family, not just with her mother, but also her grandmother and her uncle. But compared to them, she did pretty well. She really put together a good life for herself, and I think tried very hard to be happy. It's to her credit that she went to therapy in an era when that wasn't very common, and I think just to see her as a sad person is not to see the complete picture. I think there was that element to her, but I think there was a lot of elements to her. Her mother got married for the first time as a teenager. Gladys. Right? And it was not a good relationship. The gentleman was older and abusive to Gladys. She had 2 children with him, and when they separated, he kidnapped the children and took them home to Kentucky where he lived, and she was never able to retain custody of them. So that created an element of it created a hole in her life. She missed her children, as any mother would. She tried to settle down again and remarry a second time. That didn't work out either. She was a young woman, and this was the era of the flapper. So she was going out dancing and drinking and partying. And when she became pregnant by a gentleman she worked with, he was not open to being a father of this baby. So Marilyn felt from the very beginning that she was not wanted. She was an unexpected pregnancy. Her mother couldn't take care of her, so placed her in foster care. Her father rejected her, and so from the very beginning, she felt like she didn't matter. I think people around her, her mother's best friend Grace, who tried very hard at points to make sure Marilyn, then Norma Jean, was taken care of. But once that is created in a child, I don't think you ever really get rid of it. So for little Norma Jean, I think it was a very difficult, very lonely childhood. And I think that She wanted to be loved, and I think that was part of wanting to be a movie star, is to get that love. But she also wanted to be a good person. And so that's why she did things like want to learn about art or literature. She wanted to surround herself with intelligent people. I think there was this need to really create a life better than where she came from. And for the most part, she succeeded. My opinion only, but she didn't have a father figure growing up. And I think that created something where there would always be something lacking, and no one would ever be able to fill that void. She pretended that Clark Gable was her dad when she was a kid, and that she would fantasize that he would come visit her at the orphanage. And she married as a teenager. It was an arranged marriage, although I think there was a love there. But he shipped out to go to war right away. And so she was alone again. And then with Joe DiMaggio, I think, she wasn't impressed by the fact that he was a baseball legend. She was impressed by the fact that he was a good man in that strong, silent type. He was everything you would want in a man in that era. But it did backfire. He wanted her to stay at home. He wanted her to cook. He wanted to start a family. And her star was on the rise when she was with Joe DiMaggio. So that didn't really work out. It was an era when women were starting to become more independent. He was a few years older, and I think they just missed each other in that. I think with Arthur Miller, the last husband in her life, a lot of people saw them as opposites because he was so intellectual, but I don't see them that way at all. He was a playwright. He was deeply involved in theater. Marilyn was an actress, and she was studying at the Actors Studio. Arthur's sister was an actress, so they had a lot of common ground. And again, even though she wasn't college educated, she was very smart and liked to learn about these things. So someone like Arthur Miller could find kind of an intellectual equal with her. And I think it was a real meeting of the minds, which people often overlook because he had his appearance and she had her appearance. And that doesn't look... that looks weird to people, but it was a very intellectual connection. And it's a shame that it didn't work out with those two. But, if you look at her relationship with Arthur and how he spoke about her, I don't think that any man could eventually be enough for her, because when a void is created as a child, it never really gets filled, and no one can, no one's enough, basically. And it's no fault of Marilyn, and it's no fault of Arthur or any of the men. It's just a sad byproduct of her childhood. Well, there's actually very limited contact with the Kennedy brothers. That rumor started in 1964, after she had passed away, by a journalist named Frank Capel. And he was what we would now call an extremist. He was an extreme Republican or conservative, so much so that he didn't even like other Republicans who weren't conservative enough. So he was really off by himself in his extremism. So obviously he didn't like the Kennedys because they were liberal Democrats, as was Marilyn. And of course the Kennedys were very popular in 1964. John Kennedy had recently been assassinated. Robert Kennedy was looking toward the future to run for office a few years later. And Frank Capel wrote a little pamphlet, a little book, in which he accused Marilyn of having an affair with the Kennedy brothers. And it didn't really pick up steam until 10 years later in the 1970s, when other authors built on that and started writing that she had affairs with the Kennedy brothers. There's actually only 5 instances where history can put Marilyn and John Kennedy in the same room at the same time, because they're so famous. You can pretty much look up where they were on almost a daily basis. So they weren't really alone together. And it's unfortunate because it's tarnished her reputation and their reputation. And it's a rumor that goes unchecked. There is something compelling about looking at her. I mean, I don't know what it is, but you can't stop looking at her. But when you hear about her story and how hard she fought to become what she wanted to be, and before the women's movement, and before a lot of movements, before before the civil rights movement, she was very active in promoting civil rights. Before we even knew what a gay rights movement would be in the future, she was supportive of gay friends. She was very forward thinking and very modern. You could pick her up from the 1950s and put her in our era now, and she would fit pretty well. I'll go with when she was working at Radio Plane, which was in the San Fernando Valley. It's no longer there, but that's where she was working during World War II. And an Army photographer came in and took a picture of her. This was the era of Rosie the Riveter, and women were working in factories because men had gone off to war. And to inspire the brave young men who were fighting in the war, he came in to take pictures of pretty young girls working in the factories, and she was one of them because she was a pretty young girl. And he said, "You're really good at this. You should become a professional model." And that was all she needed to hear. That was what she'd wanted her whole life. So that gave her the courage to go out and get a modeling agent and start on the road of becoming Marilyn Monroe. I'm not sure. I don't think it was murder. I think it was by her own hand. What I don't know is if it was intentional or accidental, and no one can know that because we can't ask her. So for me, the autopsy report is pretty clear. She died by a barbiturate overdose, and her body proves that, and it proves that it was ingested. You can tell by the little purpley prickly marks in her stomach. That means the pills went all the way through her stomach and they were digested. You can also tell by her blood content that it was absorbed into her bloodstream. So I say that because, there's a rumor that she was held down and given an enema. We know that can't be true because the autopsy tells us she had a formed stool in her colon. So that would have been washed out with an enema. We also know that she couldn't have been held down and given a shot of anything, because the autopsy notes no needle marks. So we know for many reasons that it was ingested. What we don't know is if it was on purpose or a cry for help. Did she intend to die? Because there had been times earlier in her life when she had taken pills and it was more of a cry for help instead of wanting to die. So that was a pattern for her. So I just can't say if she did it on purpose or if it was an accident or a cry for help. But it was a pattern to do that on occasion. There's so much. I guess thank you for being such an inspiration. Because again, like I said earlier about if she can accomplish what she accomplished, then there's nothing I can't accomplish. So that has inspired me to dream big and go after my goals and to never give up. And, that's the Marilyn I try to share when I give tours, because I think that's the real Marilyn.